The year is 1929. The Roaring Twenties had peaked, and the Great Depression was about to be unleashed. But the true catastrophe wasn't the market crash itself. It was the mechanism that amplified the pain, ensuring that the wealth, which had seemingly vanished, was simply transferred to the hands of a few. The American public was told the crash was an accident, a failure of capitalism. History, however, reveals a meticulously engineered, decades-long construction project. A system deliberately designed to trap all nations in perpetual debt, funneling endless interest upward while taxpayers bear the burden. Today, as the United States national debt races toward $35 trillion and interest payments exceed the defense budget, we are witnessing the final, violent stages of this same pattern. The architecture of this coming collapse was laid down not in the 20th century, but centuries earlier, formalized by the creation of the Bank of England and perfected by the Federal Reserve. This is not prophecy, this is pattern recognition. Now, let's rewind the economy and analyze the data. The foundation of modern systemic control is the central bank, and its core function is the monetization of debt. It is a deceptively simple trick, one that transformed public policy from fiscal prudence into a perpetual motion machine of interest payments. Before the advent of permanent central banking, wars and major infrastructure projects were financed through taxation, outright plunder, or, if through debt, it was temporary and liquidated swiftly. The goal was solvency, but with the chartering of the first truly modern central bank, the Bank of England in 1694, the goal shifted from solvency to perpetual insolvency. This was the genesis of the debt engine. A government needed money to wage a war. Instead of raising taxes and facing public fury, a private banking consortium created a central bank, which essentially lent the government newly created money in exchange for government bonds. A guarantee that the citizens, through future taxes, would pay back the principal plus interest. The beauty, from the elite's perspective, was the circularity. The government gets immediate funding, and the private banks get a permanent, interest-bearing asset, the sovereign debt, backed by the full taxing power of the nation. It institutionalized the idea that a nation's prosperity was not measured by its wealth or productivity, but by its capacity to incur and service debt. The system was now designed to incentivize governments to spend far beyond their means because the funding mechanism was immediately available and carried no immediate political consequence. The United States followed this blueprint through various attempts and failures, until the ultimate realization of the plan with the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. This institution was granted the power to create money out of thin air and lend it, at interest, to the federal government. This is the moment when the system became truly inescapable. Think of it this way. When the Federal Reserve purchases government bonds, it is creating liabilities on its balance sheet, the money, but it is simultaneously receiving an interest-bearing asset, the bond. The money enters the system as debt, and the principal can only be repaid if an equivalent amount of money is created, perpetuating the debt cycle. This institutionalized structure means that every dollar in existence is a liability to the sovereign entity, the U.S. taxpayer. The national debt is not simply a high number. It is the physical representation of the wealth extraction mechanism. Each year, hundreds of billions of dollars are paid in interest on this debt, siphoning off the productive output of the nation, the labor, the ingenuity, the capital, and directing it straight into the hands of the financial elite who own the debt instruments. The setup was complete: an entity with the exclusive right to create the national currency, and a government with the guaranteed incentive to use it to fund endless projects and wars. The public, placated by temporary spending sprees and the illusion of prosperity, remains oblivious to the fundamental structural flaw. They are now the permanent collateral in a system engineered for the perpetual transfer of their wealth. The deliberate engineering of this perpetual debt machine rests upon two complementary, highly destructive pillars: fractional reserve banking and monetary inflation. Together, they form the blueprint that ensures the debt is not only perpetual, but also mathematically unpayable under the current system, forcing periodic crises that reset asset ownership in favor of the banking class. Let us deconstruct the function of fractional reserve banking, a concept often obscured by financial jargon. When you deposit $100 into a commercial bank, the bank is legally required to hold only a small fraction of that, say 10%, and is allowed to lend out the remaining $90. But where does the $90 come from? It is created as a new loan, And when that loan is deposited by the borrower into another bank, that bank, in turn, keeps 10% and lends out 90% of the new deposit. This process repeats, meaning an initial deposit of $100 can create up to $1,000 in debt money throughout the system. This creation of money through debt is crucial. Money does not enter the system through productive activity. It enters the system through the willingness of an entity, a corporation, a consumer, or the government to borrow it. This mechanism inherently mandates systemic growth in debt simply to maintain the existing money supply. If all debt were suddenly paid off, the money supply would collapse. Therefore, the very stability of the financial system requires debt to continuously expand, a mathematical requirement for a continuous, growing pool of people willing to pay interest to the architects of the system. The second pillar, monetary inflation, is the elegant weapon used to transfer wealth from the saver to the debtor, specifically, the sovereign debtor, the U.S. government, and its financial partners. When the Federal Reserve buys government bonds, it injects new liquidity into the financial system. This new money does not equally distribute across the economy. It follows what is known as the Cantillon effect. The first recipients of the newly created money, the large banks, financial institutions, and the government get to spend it at the old, higher purchasing power. By the time that money filters down to the average worker or saver, it has diluted the value of all existing currency, driving up the cost of necessities like food, fuel, and housing. The average person suffers a double theft. First, through taxes used to pay the interest on the sovereign debt. Second, through the silent tax of inflation, which erodes the purchasing power of their savings and wages. If you save money for your retirement, the central bank's inflationary policy guarantees that the real value of your savings shrinks over time, forcing you to take greater risks or work longer, effectively trapping you in the productive cycle while the elite collect the interest. This is the brilliant simplicity of the blueprint. The system is rigged such that the only way to escape the debt is to create more debt, and the only way to fund the interest payments on the sovereign debt is through a combination of taxation and inflation, both of which burden the taxpayer and enrich the holders of the debt. The game is not about economic growth or prosperity. It is about maintaining the flow of interest payments and preserving the structural integrity of the debt funnel. As we analyze the current data, we see the blueprint is running exactly as intended. High inflation is reducing the real burden of the massive debt incurred during the pandemic, but it is doing so by actively impoverishing the bottom 80% of the population. The debt is perpetual, the interest is mandatory, and the only escape valve available to the system is the periodic destruction of the currency's value. The collapse is not a failure of the system. It is the scheduled, self-correcting mechanism of the debt blueprint. The pattern we are describing is not a new invention of the 20th century. It is an immutable economic law of state collapse, codified millennia ago. To understand the future trajectory of the sovereign debt crisis in the United States, we must turn our gaze to the most powerful and enduring empire in Western history, ancient Rome. The collapse of Rome was not a singular dramatic event, but a slow, agonizing monetary decay driven by the very mechanisms of debt and debasement we see today. The Roman parallel offers an invaluable template, particularly in its reliance on the inflation for debt trade-off. In the early days of the Republic and the Empire, the denarius was a highly reliable coin containing nearly pure silver. The state was fiscally responsible, funding its massive military and infrastructure projects largely through conquest and direct taxation. Debt, while existing, did not constitute the structural foundation of the economy as it does now. The shift began during periods of military overstretch, expensive wars, and the need to fund a vast, often unproductive bureaucracy, the very pressures we observe in the modern U.S. defense and welfare budgets. Faced with persistent shortfalls, Roman emperors discovered the seductive, dangerous power of debasement. Instead of raising politically unpopular taxes, they simply reduced the silver content of the denarius, minting more coins from the same quantity of metal. For the Roman state, this was a short-term fiscal miracle. They were effectively creating money out of nothing to meet their immediate obligations, paying soldiers and settling debts. The initial recipients of this newly minted, debased coin, the officials and contractors close to the imperial center, spent it at its nominal value before the masses realized its real value had plummeted. This is the Cantillon effect in historical action, rewarding the elite closest to the mint and punishing the average citizen. The result was predictable and devastating: rampant inflation. As the quantity of money soared, and its metallic quality, its intrinsic value, collapsed. Prices for grain, oil, and land skyrocketed. The middle class, who relied on savings denominated in the currency, saw their wealth vanish. Farmers, unable to cover costs due to price controls and currency chaos, abandoned their land. Tax collection became a nightmare, as the value of the tax collected rapidly eroded. The vicious cycle mirrored the modern debt blueprint. Rome needed more money to cover its expenses and service its perpetual obligations, like the soldiers' pay. The only available tool was further debasement. By the end of the 3rd century, the silver content of the denarius was virtually non-existent, replaced by a worthless copper core. The economic engine seized up. Trade collapsed as people refused to accept the worthless imperial currency, reverting to barter or demanding payment in reliable gold. When we analyze the U.S. economy, we see the same addiction. We do not debase the metallic content of the dollar, but we debase its quantity through relentless money printing, quantitative easing, and credit expansion by the Federal Reserve. The gold standard was Rome's silver content. The removal of the gold standard in 1971 was the moment the modern empire committed to total debasement. Since then, the dollar has lost over 97% of its purchasing power, a systematic destruction of value that parallels Rome's monetary collapse. The critical lesson from Rome is this: once a sovereign power chooses the path of printing money or debt monetization over fiscal discipline, the collapse becomes a mathematical certainty, not a political choice. The empire's inability to service its obligations with sound currency led directly to its fragmentation and ultimate demise. The U.S. is now facing interest payments on its debt that are soaring due to the Fed's belated attempts to control the inflation it itself created. We are moving from the early Roman stages of gradual debasement into the late-stage panic, where the only alternatives are hyperinflationary escape or sovereign default, both of which destroy the existing social contract. The realization of the perpetual debt blueprint hinges on the precise positioning of the elite during the crisis stages. We are currently situated in the transition from Stage 3, inflationary debasement, to Stage 4, debt acceleration and elite de-risking. This is the moment when the financial class, having engineered the system to their advantage, begins the calculated process of shedding the toxic liabilities and securing the real assets. The key institution facilitating this transfer is, predictably, the Federal Reserve. For the last decade, the Fed suppressed interest rates to near zero, effectively subsidizing the debt binge of the U.S. government and large corporations. This policy guaranteed cheap credit for financial institutions, allowing them to load up on interest-earning government bonds while inflating the price of real assets like stocks and real estate assets primarily owned by the elite. When inflation inevitably materialized, spurred by years of quantitative easing and massive fiscal spending, the narrative shifted. The same institutions that profited from the low-interest environment suddenly became the voices demanding fiscal discipline and aggressive rate hikes. Why? Because the inflation they helped create began to erode the real value of their debt holdings. Their imperative changed from accumulating interest-bearing paper to protecting their principal and converting paper profits into hard, enduring assets. This move is what we call the elite funnel. As the Fed rapidly raised interest rates, two critical things happened simultaneously. The sovereign debt bomb triggered. Higher interest rates instantly multiplied the cost of servicing the staggering national debt. Every new dollar borrowed, or old debt refinanced, now carried a significantly heavier interest burden. We are now paying over $1 trillion annually in interest, which is rapidly crowding out essential government functions and pushing the U.S. toward the fiscal cliff of insolvency. This is the calculated transfer of liability. The elite-owned debt, once a steady stream of income, is now a systemic bomb handed back to the taxpayer. Asset consolidation. The rate hikes crushed the valuations of over-leveraged companies, small businesses dependent on cheap credit, and the marginal homeowner. The financial elite, sitting on enormous cash piles accumulated during the inflationary boom, are now positioned to buy these distressed asset stocks, commercial real estate, and distressed debt at fire sale prices. This is the final violent redistribution of wealth. Debt is socialized, assets are privatized. The geopolitical positioning further confirms this pattern. The de-dollarization movement, where nations like China, Russia, and the BRICS coalition seek alternatives to the US dollar for trade settlement, is not merely political maneuvering. It is a direct response to the weaponization of the US debt and the Fed's capricious monetary policy. When the US government uses its reserve currency status to issue limitless debt and export inflation, foreign holders of US debt, US Treasury bonds, become unwilling victims of the dollar's debasement. The elite understand that the US debt mechanism is now globally unsustainable. By securing tangible assets, gold, commodities, energy infrastructure, and non-US sovereign debt in more solvent jurisdictions, they are strategically insulating themselves from the inevitable default of the US sovereign model. Whether that default takes the form of hyperinflation or outright repudiation, we are witnessing the final phase of the trap. The government is forced to borrow at higher and higher rates just to cover the interest payments on old debt, creating a positive feedback loop into insolvency. The debt load accelerates exponentially, and the financial architects, having extracted the peak interest earnings, are now safely positioned outside the blast radius, ready to pick up the pieces of the collapsing economy they helped design. This maneuver is not about fighting inflation. It is about managing the controlled demolition of the debt structure to maximize elite asset acquisition before the final implosion. The average taxpayer remains trapped as the ultimate collateral. The final stage of the debt spiral is characterized by the convergence of accelerating interest payments and the public realization that the system is mathematically broken. This is the moment the sovereign debt model enters its final, violent stage, and the average person must understand the nature of the collapse to ensure their survival. The system cannot escape its own design constraints. When annual interest payments exceed the capacity of non-discretionary revenue, e.a., tax receipts minus mandatory spending on social programs and defense, the government is forced to borrow money simply to pay the interest on old debt. This is the definition of a Ponzi scheme, and it accelerates the debt trajectory exponentially, a process known in finance as a debt-driven feedback loop. We are on the precipice of this critical point in the U.S. fiscal structure. The elite, having positioned themselves, are preparing for two possible outcomes, neither of which involves the taxpayer getting a reprieve: the inflationary escape, the soft default. The Federal Reserve, under political pressure to keep the system functioning, will eventually be forced to monetize massive tranches of the soaring sovereign debt. This means printing vast sums of money to buy treasury bonds, preventing interest rates from skyrocketing further and causing a complete government shutdown. The consequence, as history proves, is uncontrolled, severe inflation, the final tax on the masses. This inflation effectively defaults on the debt in real terms. The government pays back $35 trillion worth of debt with dollars that are worth a tiny fraction of their original purchasing power. The debt burden is shed, but the average person's savings, fixed incomes, and wages are destroyed. The crisis pivot, the hard default. Should the inflationary escape fail to stabilize the market, or should foreign creditors, like the BRICS nations, aggressively reject the dollar, the financial system faces a sudden collapse of trust. This could manifest as a rapid spike in rates, forcing a dramatic restructuring or outright repudiation of debt. While politically unthinkable, the mathematical necessity of a hard default or restructuring becomes inevitable when the interest costs alone consume the nation's entire productive output. In either scenario, the core currency unit, the dollar, undergoes a severe loss of value. The ultimate warning is this: your savings, denominated in the collapsing unit of account, are the primary target of this final stage. Surviving the interest collapse. To navigate this engineered collapse, one must abandon the illusion that the system will reward saving in the sovereign currency. The elite's strategic positioning provides the blueprint for survival. The key is to convert financial assets into real assets that cannot be debased or confiscated by the mechanisms of debt monetization. Reduce exposure to paper assets. Systematically de-risk from excessive exposure to financial instruments, stocks, bonds, cash, that are highly susceptible to inflationary debasement or systemic counterparty risk. Acquire monetary metals. Gold and silver have served as the ultimate store of value through every systemic collapse in history, from ancient Rome to the Weimar Republic. They carry no counterparty risk and cannot be inflated away. Secure productive, tangible assets. Invest in assets that generate real income or provide necessary services, such as land, hard commodities, energy production, or businesses providing essential local services. These assets retain their real value and purchasing power regardless of the currency unit they are denominated in. Embrace debt reduction. While the sovereign system is designed to leverage debt for the individual, reducing consumer and unnecessary mortgage debt removes the most immediate pressure point in a deflationary credit crunch or hyperinflationary environment where cash flows become chaotic. The system was designed to trap you in a perpetual cycle of interest payment and currency destruction. The only way to escape is by recognizing the pattern, understanding the elite's de-risking strategy, and transferring your wealth out of the financial architecture and into the safety of tangible, unconfiscatable assets. The time for deliberation is over. The debt engine is at maximum speed, and the collapse is the necessary final function of its design. The journey from the genesis of the central banking fraud to the mathematical inevitability of the sovereign debt spiral reveals a clear truth. Every crisis is a controlled event, a managed transfer of wealth from the broad population to the few who understand and profit from the monetary architecture. We have analyzed the data, traced the Roman parallel, and identified the precise actions of the smart money. The coming economic turbulence will not spare those unprepared, but knowledge is the ultimate insurance. Strategic positioning now, focusing on tangible wealth preservation and operational solvency, ensures that when the system finally implodes, you are not trapped within its collapsing structure, but positioned to thrive in the new economic reality.